No, but I'm so pleased to be introducing Donny today. Donny is a longtime collector and an ephemerist. He is co-founder and vice president of the Ephemera Society of Canada, and he presently serves on the board of the Ephemera Society of America. He has presented at previous Ephemera Society conferences on the Dion quintuplets, on courier knives, and on the bicycle in 19th century America. And in Canada, he did a very important presentation on the history of the Hudson's Bay Company some years ago. I'm going to embarrass him a little further. Donny and I and a few others in this group are, in addition to being ephemerists, we are avid Sherlockians. So we're very interested in Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle. And this year at our annual, we have a society in Toronto, which is the Bootmakers of Toronto, that's the Sherlock Holmes Society of Canada. At our annual awards banquet, there are 3 awards that can be given out. One is for the best formal presentation of the year. The other is for the best non-formal presentation or event. And the third is for the best article written in our journal, Canadian Homes. And this year, Donny won all 3 of those awards. It's never happened before. In Canada, where we say there are only 2 seasons, summer and hockey, Donny won the hat trick. So I'm very proud of him and very, very happy to be introducing him today, Donny Zaldin.
Mary Beth? You just stepped outside. I want someone to kill the lights a bit. Thank you. Mary Beth, can we kill the lights a bit? Okay.
I'm not sure which of these many photos. That would be wrong. That's okay though, because you can see the screen.
Perfect. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Barbara. I'd like to personally thank the Ephemera 34 Conference Committee for including me as a speaker at its prestigious 2014 conference. And on behalf of the conferees and all the members of the Ephemera Society of America, I would like to thank the entire committee and its chair, Barbara Lowe, and ESA President Nancy Rosen for the excellent job they did devising the theme for this year's conference, searching out the 8 learned speakers we heard on Friday, and carrying out its mandate so successfully. Kudos to all the exhibitors for their wonderful exhibitions in the room down the hall, and if you haven't seen the exhibits, you should before you leave. You really should. Thanks to my Canadian entourage, my wife Barbara, and our American Express card Dana, we never leave home without her. And especially all of you who, after a long weekend of either trying to sell ephemera or buy ephemera or run a conference, you're here this morning at a time where everybody wouldn't mind sleeping, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. The Ephemera Society of America's 2014 conference posited the following theorem as the theme of its 2014 of its conference, entitled Food and Drink from Field to Table. The food Victorians planted, harvested, packaged, advertised, sold, purchased, prepared, and consumed was a reflection of themselves and their culture, sometimes mirroring it and sometimes influencing it. The theory was proved via images of ephemera of food and drink in the scholarly and beautifully illustrated presentations of our 8 speakers on Friday.
It's going automatically.
Dr. William Weisweaver, internationally renowned food historian and author, expounded on the definition, categorization, value, and future of culinary ephemera and demonstrated how it leaves paper trails of American social history. Stephen Miller, longtime ephemerist and leading ESA member and author, demonstrated how a small American religious sect, the New Lebanon, New York Shaker Society, supported itself through the growing and the processing, the advertising, and the marketing of simple garden seeds, which evidenced the economics of that insular community and reflected its non-secular sensibilities. Michael Russo, Valentine collector, visual artist, and master gardener, presented a feast of humorous and evocative images of the staple food, the tomato, which Andy Warhol later turned into high art. Elizabeth Young, antiquarian bookseller, exhibited the ephemera of holographic remedies and recipes which predated the 1906 Food and Drug Act, with post-enactment ephemera which created new social considerations such as the rise of corporate food processing. Henry Voigt, leading authority on the American menu, demonstrated from his significant private collection that menus provide historical and cultural evidence of society far beyond what its members are eating. Michael Osborne, who Michael Osborne, who unfortunately fell ill and could not attend on Friday to deliver his presentation, is a leader in commercial food and drink brand identity and package design, especially iconic wine labels. And he was scheduled to provide us with an understanding of the importance and subtle meaning of these labels, but unfortunately, he could not attend. John Sayers, pinch hit for him, collector and ESA member and director, spoke in his stead on Dining at Sea, focusing not only on menu cover images, but also on the technical and social issues during that Victorian experience. Don Lindgren, a lifelong antiquarian bookseller, especially on food and drink, took us on a guided tour of the varied and interesting ephemera of the history of cocktails in America and abroad. Regrettably, the latest winter storm prevented Leslie M. Beam and Special Collections College librarian and Shirley Brocker Sliker, a remarkable collector of colorful brochures of food and beverage, which became known as little cookbooks, from being here in person, but with the new technology, they Skyped in their presentation, which we all enjoyed, on food distribution from 1880 to 1920 and World War II as important resources of social conditions and changes during these periods. And following my presentation this morning, so nobody leaves, there will be 2 shorter flash presentations by Dr. Daniel Gifford, entitled Star Spangled Turkeys, Patriotic Metaphors, we say patriotic in Canada, in Thanksgiving Postcards, and by Gail McMillan, entitled Dear Nanny, Yours Devotedly, Charlie. Finally, it's my turn to literally follow the food chain from the farm to the local market to manufactories in the city, hence to urban consumers via marketing techniques, principles, and advertising techniques, hence the title of my presentation, From Market to Market, and then to move outside the box to examine the advertising which portrayed the benefits and beneficiaries of the new world, but not its burdens and those who bore them. Canadian author and social anthropologist Margaret Visser writes that the past is the only area we have left ourselves to explore. And the past I am exploring today is, of course, the Victorian era. What else? Named in honor of the longest-serving British monarch for the period to which she lent her name. 19th century Britain and America, which mirrored in large part the British experience, transformed the modern 20th century into as a result of the confluence of 5 virtually contemporaneous developments. One was the Industrial Revolution, where people existed on a subsistence level previously, and the revolution and the technological changes transformed that to mass production. The population shifted from rural to urban as people moved to the cities in order to work in the factories to mass produce goods, including food and drink. That created a working middle class. Instead of just having a lower class and an upper class, you now had a middle class. It had some money in its pocket, which it had to spend now because it was no longer growing its own food and making its own clothes. At the same time, we had the new printing process of color lithography, and created or invented at the same time were marketing principles and advertising techniques. And this created what I call a perfect Victorian storm, which brings us, which will help us prove the theorem of the conference committee. That storm led in many ways to a better world, which was illustrated in ubiquitous trade cards, featuring a plethora of goods and services, a literal cornucopia of canned and bottled foods and drink manufactured to be consumed by happy, healthy, and prosperous-looking families, men, women, and children, depicted so vividly in the evolving medium of trade cards. In the early to mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution's advances in science and technology transformed, as I said, the individual-oriented subsistence economy to a collective one of mass production, resulting in a shift in demographics from rural to urban Britain and America, with a concomitant restructuring of society and the nature of family life. In America, a nascent middle class emerged to consume the never-before-conceived-of products, including ready-made clothing and patent medicines created in the burgeoning, smoke-belching manufactories. The pickle barrel of the general store was replaced by bottles and tins with their preserved contents, modernizing and forever altering the food delivery system from field to table. Victorian advertising rested on chromolithography, a process as revolutionary to the world of the printing arts as industrialization was to the world economy and social structure. Chromolithographed trade cards were originally distributed to existing and potential customers, often at point of sale, functioning as maps and advertising goods and services. Economic Darwinism resulted in part through the evolution of advertising, offering consumers the choice between competing manufacturers and different products and services. The imagery of fine art was adapted to commercial art to convey authority, availability, and quality of whatever was being purveyed, proving the 1771 maxim of American editor John Dunlap, "It pays to advertise." Especially after images were added, Victorian trade cards began to provide a graphic visual record of the social history of that period, telling a story of life in a simpler, less cynical time. While a visual delight to be preserved and cherished, they also provide evidence of our collective past and both reconstruct and represent a lost culture. Ephemera such as trade cards, magazine and newspaper advertisements, pamphlets, boxes, tins, and bottles of Victorian comestibles and potables depict their journey from field to table, achieved through marketing principles and advertising techniques. Idyllic domestic scenes and illustration of harmonious families, beautiful women, and healthy children were used to promote products of all kinds at a time when longevity of life was an uncertain proposition at best, so the combination of contentment, beauty, and youth equated to success, health, and happiness. Nathaniel Currier, and then Currier and Ives, portrayed and mass-marketed a wide variety of single-stone hand-colored lithographs on almost every aspect of American history and life, current events, and popular culture. The company's 19th century ad hoc democratic vistas led to the company calling itself Printmakers to the American People. Currier and Ives idealized rural life and urban life in America, providing a graphic visual record of the country's social history of that period, sometimes mirroring national trends and sometimes shaping them. The technological progress and material success of the 19th century were heralded in both prints and trade cards. Countries and companies boasted the new processes and products in trade exhibitions and world fairs, London in 1851, Philadelphia in 1876, and Chicago in 1893, at which trade cards were routinely printed and handed out at the exhibit booths, later forming the bases of the great institutional trade card collections of Jefferson Burdick at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Bella Landauer at the New York Historical Society. This year's conference extrapolated from a quote of actress Sophia Loren to derive the theme of Ephemera 34, that the food that the Victorians produced, processed, disseminated, and ate reflected themselves in their culture. For the record, Miss Loren has always been my favorite movie star, and her beauty, elegance, and grace ranks her behind only my own First Lady, Barbara Rush, tying for second place with our society's First Lady, our own Nancy Rosen. Victorian images abound of the breadth and wealth of Victorian food and drink, a visual smorgasbord, which is pun intended, which is reflected in the advertising trade cards of the day. For example, well-fed babies growing up into well-fed, hungry children, enjoying meals later of meat and soup, washed down by more meat, washed down by Coca-Cola, and then into adults who enjoyed coffee and dessert. Using the terminology of social anthropologist and the before-mentioned author Margaret Visser, Victorian society created itself by acting out its aims and fantasies in the form of trade cards and prints. Witness the lovely family scene of father, mother, young children, baby, and even dog in their well-appointed home. But despite my concerted efforts, I'm extremely hard-pressed to show you contrasting scenes depicting the lower class have-nots bearing the harsh burdens of the century's technological revolution. But as we all know, not all is as it appears to be, illustrated by these metamorphic trade cards. Buckingham's dye, which produces a younger, more vital gentleman. Mayflower chewing tobacco. The fellow on the right now has a smile and a kick in his step. Globe shirt collar and cuff, where an acceptance of the suitor's proposal is pictured on the right. Lily cornstarch, a happier meal and marriage. And Crocker's phosphate, which produces significantly, that's wrong. Never mind. Significantly larger cabbages. You can hardly make out this cabbage. Look at the size of those cabbages. Okay. And you can see a more prosperous life and lifestyle. Witness the first commercial Christmas card, which was commissioned by Londoner Sir Henry Cole in 1843, 8 years before he successfully managed Prince Albert's pet project, the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations. An enlargement of the card allows a better study of the artwork, with its central panel showing 3 generations of a prosperous family raising a toast to the card's recipient, in this case, Cole's good friend at the top, my good friend John Thompson, Esquire, at this time of year, which Dickens called when want, was quoted when wrote, when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. On both sides of the panel, left and right, at the margins of the card are scenes of charity, with food and clothing being given to the poor. While the card's patron, Henry Cole, and its illustrator, John Calcott Horsley of the Royal Academy, acknowledged members of the lower classes with some sympathy, as you can see, to most other beneficiaries of the scientific and technological changes of that time. These unfortunates, the lower classes, the have-nots, neither mattered nor figured into the picture, except in the margins of society and in its pretty printed imagery. As a result, with great respect to Signora Loren, I formulated my own theory, namely that many Victorians, which social research in both Britain and America estimate at 25% of the population, that's 1 person in 4, owed nothing to spaghetti or the new products of the industrial age. Period books, magazines, letters, journals, lithographs, and photographs illustrate that the appealing images of families in their modern genteel living conditions and lifestyle, and the array of newly available packaged goods belied a harsher reality, an illusory horn of plenty, while the Industrial Revolution's burdens of squalor and misery were visited upon the socioeconomic underclass, whom social historians have labeled the other Victorians, who suffered from privation, illiteracy, poor health, and ironically, hunger. Trade cards depicted the belching smokestacks of the industrial age, at that time considered to represent success and the magnitude of their business and business processes rather than pollution as it does today, with civilized assembly lines of well-dressed and willing labor force of women and children. After a thorough but relatively unsuccessful search for trade card or lithographic imagery of the negative consequences of the Industrial Revolution, I turned to the printed word and the photographic history of the age. English social researcher Henry Mayhew published numerous articles which were collected in book form. This is his opus magnum, London Labor and the London Poor, whom he divided into those that will work, those that cannot work, and those that will not work. And in the book are contained studies and interviews with a gamut of beggars, street entertainers, market traders, prostitutes, laborers, sweatshop workers, even down to the mudlarks. How many are familiar with that expression? Yeah. Of course. Valerie. Boys and girls, men and women who searched the stinking mud of the banks of the Thames, of the River Thames, for items of value such as copper nails, bits of coal and iron, bones, wood, washed up trinkets to sell. And the pure finders, and the pure finders who literally collected dog feces to sell to tanners for the tanning process. Mayhew described their clothes, how and where they lived, their entertainments and customs, and he made detailed estimates of the numbers and incomes of those practicing each trade, and showed how marginal and precarious were the lives of so many in what at that time was the richest city in the world. A particular concern, both in Britain and America, was the urban problem of drunkenness. And many of us know the drunkard's progress from the first glass and alcoholism becoming a greater and more riveting addiction until finally the drinker commits suicide at step 9. And this is of the working man who could now afford, because he's working in a factory, to buy gin, wine, beer, and once addicted spiraled downwards, taking his wife and children with him. But many of those, to use Mayhew's terminology, who could not work or would not work, and even some of those who did work for long hours in less than ideal conditions for minimal wages, they lived in crowded urban quarters. Sorry, these are still the drinking's consequences. And here are the crowded living quarters, London on the left, and this is a sort of a lodging for the workers at a manufactory in Pennsylvania of the period in communal work. Okay, and then for those who actually could not afford to sustain themselves, women were herded into communal workhouses, and so were children. And there's the Oliver Twist Crookshank engraving of 1838, and it's not that much different 50 years later. English man of letters Samuel Johnson wrote that to have a just notion of the city, London, one must survey not only its great streets and squares, but also its back streets and alleys where, quotes, the municipality of human habitations are crowded together, end quotes. I took that advice, and I have pictured the overcrowded, bustling city streets in which poverty is ever present and drunkenness common in in England and America. Above, this is New York City, where 80 horses a day died in the streets and kids still played there. And this is above ground. It's a matchstick lady, a flower lady, rags peddler, match girl on the right, the young man, boy in the middle selling rabbits. Poor children at work in the streets, mudlark at the left, and the sewer hunter or pure finder at the right. These are street sweepers, so there's individuals and a toff paying some street children to clear the intersection at which he either lives or does business or crosses. These are children working below grade in the mines, long hours, terrible wages. 19th century novelist and social reformer Charles Dickens was the first author to describe the modern city of the 19th century and its profound effect on society, and in particular on everyday people. The list of subjects on which Dickens wrote so graphically and passionately supports his place in history as the city's most significant chronicler, and at the time he was known as, quotes, London's special correspondent. Let's look at the themes at the bottom: poverty, overcrowding, hunger, squalor, lack of sanitation, disease, houselessness, infant and child mortality, child labor, prostitution, illiteracy, lack of education, crime workhouses, and debtors' prisons. In Dickens' magazines, Sketches by Boz, Household Words, and All the Year Round, and his novels, Oliver Twist, The Christmas Carol, you can read the list. One finds the great social issues of the times created by the Industrial Revolution as recurring themes. Poverty, squalid living conditions, and overcrowding are common backdrops to novels such as David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, and A Christmas Carol. Focal points include the debtor's prison in Little Dorrit, the workhouse in Oliver Twist, criminal activity epitomized by the likes of Fagin, the Artful Dodger, and a gang of youthful pickpockets, again in Oliver Twist, and in the opium dens in The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Prostitutes are featured in the character of Nancy in Oliver Twist, child labor practices and the abuse of children highlighted in Nicholas Nickleby, and the high incidence of child mortality by the death of the 13-year-old little Nell Trent in The Old Curiosity Shop. Ebenezer Scrooge weighs in on the issue of prisons by dismissing them summarily in A Christmas Carol, and Pip tours Newgate Prison in Great Expectations. Dickens tackled all of these byproducts of industrialization in his mission to effect reforms to alleviate the cruel conditions which he believed were unjustly borne by the lower classes. To quote Dickens' 1859 novel of a foreign revolution, 1789 to 99, the French Revolution, one of a different kind, the social history of Victorian England and America is not a tale of two cities, but a tale of two classes, through which the prism of the momentous changes of the half-century are reflected. It was the best of times. It was also the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom and foolishness, belief and incredulity, light and darkness, where people had everything and other people had nothing, and some people were going directly to heaven and some directly to hell. In conclusion, I say that the stark and sometimes brutal images seen in photographs of the less privileged, unfortunate lower classes are virtually invisible in 19th century trade cards and prints. An illusion is defined as a deception which produces a false or misleading impression of reality. And the impression that both the upper and the lower classes of Britain and America could each take a part and advantage of the products being mass-produced and purveyed in 19th century advertising is nothing more than a false and misleading illusion. Thank you. Any questions, or did I answer everything? Yes, Beth?
Is there any evidence of direct reaction to advertisements by common people or upper class people? I'm not talking about Dickens and Mayhew, but normal people who aren't trying to document social conditions.
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
Do we know what people thought about those advertisements? The advertising that changed and showed kids and families.
Well, to be fair, in America, I said that they were virtually invisible. There were the comic, there were the trade cards that treated racial and ethnic minorities with great disdain, thinking that was comic. And I never quite understood, and maybe it's just me, but I never understood how that sold the product. But you portrayed black people at the time as comic, and Jews with the ethnic stereotype, and the same with Irish and drinking and so on, which is obviously politically incorrect these days, as it should be. But aside from those examples, I didn't see them in trade cards. Have I answered your question? No.
I want to know if there's any evidence about how people reacted to those advertisements.
I'll give you a, not a pat answer, but an opinion. I think the haves, it didn't touch them. And the have-nots, I don't know that they were ever looking at the advertising, so I'd say no. It's my opinion.
But the advertising worked.
The advertising sold products to people who had the money to buy them, absolutely. And it was 3/4 of the people. But 1/4 of the people, that's a lot. Yes.
I would just suggest that it might be not uncommon to what we look at today in our TV, where you see everybody thin and everybody young and everybody driving an Audi or a...
Glenn, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. I'm not pretending that.
Say, yeah, and some of us say, wait a minute, that's not us. You know, but we don't say anything about it. Advertising keeps going.
The more things change, the more they remain virtually exactly the same. I absolutely agree with that. Kit.
I would say that it has changed a great deal in respect to the fact that advertising has become more insidious, climbing into your head more and more, and to the point where the American public is stupid. They don't know what's being done to them, right? And they just go out and run. But they're being formed, their behavior has been formed by this over these decades, and their behavior is increasing.
Okay. Yes?
I would just like to add, that's a great question, that a lot of the advertising is depicting the happiest people in life and well off. It's aspirational. Now, we think of it now
Aims and
as
fantasies.
aspirational. I'm wondering, was it aspirational at the time, or if 75% of people didn't need to aspire to that because they were there, and 25 couldn't even dream of it?
Well, more were middle class and newly created,
So
working.
yeah, I guess that's if we're talking about 3 different groups of people, were some of them seen as aspirational, were some of them seen as them as a reflection of their own life, and then the 25%?
Not exactly to my mind, because the Currier and Ives lithographs, they're mostly rural and bucolic and the country scene and the seasons and so on, yet America is being industrialized at a very quick pace. So I think that they were fantasies, cultural fantasies. Yes?
I think advertising is a continuum of aspiration because American capitalism is based on not reaching one level, but continually trying to gain more and have more possession. So
Sure.
it never stops. People are always consuming.
Yes. Anyone else?
Yeah, to an extent,
Art.
we have a chance to revisit history because we are rapidly reverting to 400 years ago.
Could you speak up? I'm sorry.
I said we have an opportunity to study history and its repetition because we're rapidly becoming a two-tier society. And if it doesn't change in the next 20 years, we'll be right back.
I've heard that argument.
Study it. Let the ephemeral. And nothing changes.
But do we learn anything? That's the question. Yeah, Diane.
But just a related comment to Beth's, it's very difficult to find evidence of how people at the time viewed advertising. Rob and I read thousands of 19th century letters, even in a particular year, in the course of what we do. And it's just thinking of this particular conference, it's really rare to find anybody talking about what they ate. Really rare. And that goes with people who are virtually illiterate and writing some very sketchy thing to a relative, or somebody who's quite prolific. And so that's sort of interesting too. It's not something you often talk about or notice in a recorded way.
I think in fairness to the flash presenters, I'd be pleased to sit down and answer any questions later. Thank you all so much for coming out on Sunday morning at this arguably ungodly hour.